Okay, guys, so today we're going to be talking about leak detection systems. And leak detection systems for air conditioning are a little bit different than leak detection systems for any other automotive system. Because if you remember with air conditioning, what we have basically is refrigerant inside of our system, and the only thing to leak out are either refrigerant or oils. So we have to have something that is able to detect either refrigerant or oils as they leak out of our system. So what I've got these two tools right here. Both of these are Sniffer type leak detection systems. And we'll start with this green one here. So this guy is set up for R134 leak detection. And you can see it plugs in, it charges, it's got its own power adapter. But basically we come up and we turn it on with our green button right here on the left. And you see that it starts running, or it starts flashing right here across the top. Now, as it's flashing, that means that it is working. And you can also hear, hopefully you can hear that. You can hear a motor running inside of it. And we can adjust our sensitivity right here, high or low. You see the color of the bar changes right here. So I can adjust my sensitivity, high, low, or maximum. Okay, but you hear the motor running inside of this. And what we're doing is, oh, now we're beeping, now we're warmed up. So now it will actually work. But the motor running inside of this, if you look down here, there's a tip right here on the end of this. This is actually drawing air through this entire apparatus, and what it's doing is it's looking for refrigerant in the air that it's drawing into itself. So that motor running you hear is it's drawing air into the tip, into the machine itself. It's detecting R134 or R12 or whatever refrigerant these are designed to detect, and it will beep, steady beep or a faster beep as it finds the leak. So what we do with this, and I'll show you guys in a little bit as far as what we do with it on a car, we're going to hold the end of this up to whatever component we're testing, and if it starts beeping faster or we get a steady beep, that means our leak is going to be in that area because it has detected refrigerant. Okay? So let me turn this guy off. So there's one version. Our other version is going to be this guy right here, this snap-on guy. And he's going to work pretty much the same. You've got your tip right here, your sniffer tip, that we're going to use to hold up to whatever we are detecting. And then you see we've got our power button down here. We're going to power this guy on. And it'll beep until it warms up like this. So this means that it's warming up. Again, we're just warming up with the beeping. Okay. Now that it has just gone to a steady beep, we can hit mute. But you hear the motor spinning in this guy as well. So we're drawing air in from our tip. You see this one is lighted on the end. This one shows you a number right here. The higher the number means the higher concentration of refrigerant that is picking up. We can adjust our sensitivity right here. We've also got a light on the end of this one where we can shine on whatever component we're looking at. That makes it nice. But as we get closer to whatever our leak is, we will get a number from 0 to 9 right here, and also our tip will begin to flash faster. And if we turn the mute off, again we have a beep. This will start beeping faster as we get closer to our refrigerant leak as well. Okay, so these are sniffer type systems. Now the nice thing about sniffer type systems is they're easy to use. Okay, the bad thing about sniffer type systems is you can trick them easily. So let's turn this guy back on. He should be warmed up here really soon. But you can trick sniffer type systems fairly easily because they are drawing air into them. So any air that is contaminated with exhaust can trigger this sniffer to have a bad reading. Let me actually blow into the end of this and we'll see what we get. So you hear how it's freaking out right there, and I'm actually getting a number displayed. That's just with me simply blowing into the tip. So the sniffer type systems right here, you have to be careful with contaminated air. You have to be careful if there's a fan, an engine fan blowing, such as a radiator fan, cooling fan, because remember, when our AC system's running, we should have a coolant fan running as well. So you have to be careful with that, because if it gets too much air into the tip, it will give you a false reading. Okay, so that's my only complaint with these sniffer type systems, is you can get a lot of false readings. Also, if the system, the leak itself is not large enough, then it might be diluted, being out in atmospheric air, that the sniffer itself might not pick up on it. Okay, so that's another downside of these, is you have to have a large enough leak to where, as you're moving this around, that the refrigerant actually gets picked up by the sniffer. Okay, so that's another issue with these. They're not perfect. Personally, myself, I don't like using these because these are several $100s a piece. And again, you don't have quite the accuracy that for me would justify several $100s. But lots of shops use these. Lots of people swear by these. So, you know, these are one option for leak detection. So let's look at another option. Okay, so our other option for leak detection is going to be dye, ultraviolet or UV dye. So basically what we do is we inject an ultraviolet dye, and I've got a little container of it right here. You can also use this for engine oils, transmission oils, even put some in your radiator if you're having a hard time pinpointing a leak, because this dye will mix with whatever fluid or whatever refrigerant we're using and go throughout the entire system. And wherever we have a leak that is large enough for oil or, you know, fluids to leak out, it will bring this dye with it because it's mixed in with whatever we put this dye in. So there are different dyes for engine oil, transmission oil, power steering, coolant, etc. But some of them are universal or some are air conditioning specific. So this little bottle is just some universal stuff. Right here I've got a AC specific dye right here, universal AC dye for all AC systems. And basically how this stuff works is we inject it or we add it to our AC system. So there's several different versions of how I can do this. Some are in a AC can, such as like the R12 cans that you buy from auto parts stores, or sorry, 134 cans that you buy from auto parts stores, that have about 3 ounces of dye with refrigerant mixed in, and you simply hook it up to your AC machine or your manifold gauges, have the system on and running, and it gets sucked from that can into the system. This guy right here is, we open the bag, and hey, first time use right here, but this guy will look like a big syringe. I've got an end right here, I've got O-rings, I've got another end right here that I can unscrew, but basically I put it in this caulking gun looking apparatus right here. If you've ever used a caulk gun, you know, you pull it back like this, our AC dye goes in it, and then we can crank this down. We unscrew our end. I'm not going to unscrew it just because this stuff does leak. It does get messy. But we unscrew our cap here. We screw this guy on. And basically then what we do is we take this and we can inject this into a low port or low pressure fitting on our AC system. Okay? This little guy right here is just an adapter for R12 systems. We don't use it. But basically this is screwed on. I come up, I snap this onto the low pressure port of my AC system, and I squeeze this and inject a certain amount of dye. And this is graduated on the side here. It tells you how many ounces you're using. Normally you'd only put like 1 ounce of dye in the AC system and have the system run, have the system on when you're injecting this, so that, again, we're putting it in on the low side so that everything gets drawn in and everything's going to mix with the system. Okay, the system has to be working. It has to be able to run for this dye to work. You can't just put dye in a system that doesn't work or has a huge leak to where it will not hold refrigerant, because you won't have enough time for this dye to mix with the refrigerant and the oil, and it basically coats the entire inside of the AC system. And then once we get a leak, the dye leaks out and we can find it. How do we find it? It's ultraviolet dye. So how we find this ultraviolet dye leak is a kit like this, or we have it included in this kit. It's a set of orange glasses or yellow glasses and an ultraviolet light. Okay, so it's basically a flashlight that shows ultraviolet. So you see, even in normal light right here, when I shine this ultraviolet light up to it, see how this stuff glows all of a sudden? That's what you're looking for. You're looking for that glow, and it's going to be a bright green glow. Okay, same thing for the stuff in the caulk gun. You see how brightly green that stuff is glowing under ultraviolet light? It's even better with our yellow goggles right here. We'll see if this works. It gets even brighter. Okay, let me turn the lights off real quick, and I'll show you how this stuff glows under darkness. Okay, so there's our lights off. Look how this stuff is glowing, okay? Again, ultraviolet's great. It's great for finding leaks. And then if I take our yellow glasses and shine, it becomes even more pronounced. So that's what we're looking for. Do you need to do this in perfect darkness? No. Just don't have any other lights under the hood. When you're checking for this stuff, you should be good. You can even see this in normal daylight, because again, with the normal lights on, this stuff still glows bright enough that you can see it. Okay, so you're going to do the ultraviolet flashlight, or some have a light that plugs into the car battery, cigarette lighter, etc., etc. Do you necessarily need these yellow goggles? No, you don't, but they do help in defining the difference with this UV light. Okay, also with this kit, you see we have these stickers right here. And basically these stickers are what we would put on any vehicle that we inject dye or do any kind of leak detection type injection of dye, or there's other chemicals for leak detection. So anytime we do that, we put one of these stickers on the vehicle so that in case another technician diagnoses the vehicle or has to look at it, that they know what has been done. Okay, so we use these stickers when we add dye to the engine, the transmission, power steering, etc., etc. This lets the next guy know that something has been added. Okay, so you always want to use that sticker if you do inject dye into the AC system. It's just nice for the next guy. Okay, so let's go ahead and head out to the lab and we'll see how this stuff works. Hey guys, we're out here in the lab with our AC leak detector, our sniffer here. So remember this guy, we got to turn it on here. It'll beep until it's warmed up. You can turn the beep off by hitting the mute button right here, and it'll just flash, 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 and keep showing 0 until we're fully warmed up. And then once it's warmed up, one of these two, either the green or the red light, will light up solid, and you'll hear the motor run. And right now I hear the motor run, and you see we've got a green light lit up. That is our sensitivity. So we're normal sensitivity, or we can adjust it to high sensitivity. I'm going to just put it on high because, like I said, these aren't perfect, but high sensitivity tends to work a little bit better than the low sensitivity. We also have a built-in light. You can hit that button and there's a light that'll light up so we can see exactly where we're going. But what I would do with this is I would take this sniffer end and I would run it all along the lines, along the fittings right here, like you see where this line goes into my AC compressor. And I would run my sniffer right there where those fittings, because those O-rings tend to leak. And then I'd follow the lines as much as I could down in here, and I know it's kind of hard to see, but I would follow the lines to every fitting, looking for the leak. You know, follow the lines on up into the car, into the evaporator core. Also, don't forget to check up here with your condenser. Run it along there. And again, it's going to take some time to do one of these leak detections properly, just because we want to trace out as much as we possibly can. So like right here, I'm going to get in and sniff this AC fitting right here. You know, where the lines are. Back here where my expansion valve goes into the car, I want to sniff. But like I said, follow the lines. Any place you see fittings, we definitely want to sniff around those fittings, rubber lines, etc. Go over to the other side right here. Here's my high side fitting. My receiver dryer, you know, check the O-rings on it. Any place there's O-rings, O-rings leak, O-rings dry out and cause a place to possibly have a leak. Obviously this car has no leaks, but I just wanted to show you the process of actually going through with our sniffer here and checking for leaks. So what does our sniffer do when it actually finds a leak? Everybody always wants to know, because most of our cars out here in the shop do not have any leaks in our AC system. But if we do find a leak, such as right here on our fitting right here, you see it lit up briefly for a second there, and it also flashed a number up here. So let's make a little bit of a leak real quick here, okay? So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to push down on the Schrader valve in the system here real quick. Just release a little bit of refrigerant. Not enough to make a mess. And now I'm going to take my tool. You see, oh, I'm displaying. Let me turn the mute off right here. Let's make another leak. Okay, let's take our tool. And you see right there, I showed a number of a 6 or an 8 of like, wow, there's a big leak. But now it's stopped. Well, that's just because I had a little brief amount coming out of this AC fitting. You hear I've got a little bit of residual refrigerant in there. So this is fairly sensitive as well. I keep showing a 1 or a 2. And there's another 1. But basically, and you see the tip lights up and it flashes. But this is what it acts like when I find a leak. It beeps, it gets your attention. The very tip down here flashes. It displays a number of how severe the leak is or how severe the concentration of refrigerant is. So it is fairly sensitive as far as finding a leak. Let me just see if I can really freak it out here. Oh, look, I got a 5 right there. I just put it in there. Oh, look, I got a 9 and then a 5. Let me turn the mute off here. Make a leak, yep. So, anyway, there's what this thing looks like when it actually does find an AC leak. It actually lets you know, okay? So again, this is our 134A leak detection sniffer right here. All right, so here's our dye injection kit for our UV dye leak detection. This is what it looks like assembled. This is a different one than I originally showed you guys just because I didn't want it to get put together and leak in the box, but this one's fully assembled. So it's basically like a caulk gun. You've got a tube of the UV dye connected to a hose, and then you've got a fitting that will go onto the low side service port, okay? So basically all you do with this is you find the low side service port, which in this vehicle is right there, and you're going to snap this on and squeeze the trigger to inject some dye. It's easier with the engine running and the AC on, okay? Because, like I said, the system needs to be working for the dye to mix with the oil and the refrigerant to be dispersed throughout the system. Because if the system has such a huge leak that it cannot hold refrigerant, there's nothing to mix the dye and you're never going to find the leak. So again, the system has to be functioning enough to hold a charge long enough to get the dye dispersed through the system. So a couple minutes, 3 to 5 minutes usually is enough time for this dye to move through the whole system. So if your system will work for a day, 2 days, a week, perfect. That's perfect amount of time to get this dye moved through the system and leak out wherever that leak is so that you can detect that leak, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and start this truck up, and then we'll hook this up and inject our dye. All right, so our truck is running. So now I'm going to take my fitting and I'm going to snap it onto the low side pressure port. Once it's snapped on, then I can take my dye gun, and remember there's a gradient on the side here that'll show us how many ounces of dye are going into the truck, okay? So each line is 1/4 of an ounce of dye. So I'm just going to basically squeeze, and you'll see this move, and I'm going to put 1/4 of an ounce of dye in our system. So there's 1/4 of an ounce. And then another 1/4 of an ounce. So there's 1/2 ounce of dye in our system. That is usually more than enough to coat the entire system. Now, if you had a system with a front and rear air, you might want to put more dye into the system, but I wouldn't do more than 1 or 2 ounces total of dye, okay? Little goes a long way with this stuff. So once we have our dye injected, then I can simply disconnect, and there we are, okay? But the thing to remember is, with this leak detection system, you're going to have the residue of dye right there. So, don't forget to clean it off, because if I took my UV light right now, you see it looks like my leak is right there. It's really not. That's where I injected dye. So I have to clean that off completely before I started looking for leaks. Otherwise, I'd be like, oh, there's the leak, replace the Schrader valve. No, that's where you ejected the dye. Clean that off. Use some brake cleaner, a rag, make sure all of that dye gets removed, and then start your leak diagnosis. But there's how to inject the dye into our system. And like I said, some auto parts stores have a little can, a 3 to 5 ounce can of dye with 2 ounces of refrigerant in. You can hook it up to that little refrigerant hose that they sell and suck it right into the system that way. That's how you do it at home. A shop, you'd normally do it like this. Alright, so we're back on our Titan that we did our sniffer leak detection on. If you remember, I lit a little bit of refrigerant out of this service port right here. Well, we'll just assume that that service port is leaking. It's really not, but we'll just say that it's leaking. How do I know that? Well, I can do a UV dye test. This truck has ultraviolet dye in the system already, and I can take my good old UV light and shine on this fitting, and you'll see that it's glowing green. And that is because the UV dye in the oil, and when I released that little bit of refrigerant for our sniffer test, it brought a little bit of oil and dye with it. And you see I've got some dye kind of splattered down here, some glowing there on the line where that little oil splattered. But if I were to see this in the real world, then I would assume that I have a leak right here at this service port. These Schrader valves inside of there, they do go bad. They do leak. It's just like a Schrader valve on a valve stem for a tire. So they are serviceable. They can be replaced without replacing the entire line, but they do leak. They do go bad. So again, this is a good, hey, where is the leak? I can't find it. Just go over everything with a UV light. Wherever you see that glowing green, that's going to be a potential spot where our UV dye on our oil has escaped and a potential leak. Alright, so I'm under one of the Titans. Another very common failure point for AC is the evaporator. Okay, and the evaporator, if you remember, is under the dash of our car. So how do I know if I have an evaporator leak, or even the O-rings for the expansion valve that is attached to that evaporator? Well, if you can see up here past my oxygen sensor, you're going to see a black hose coming out of the firewall. And I'll try to highlight that in the video a little bit, but you'll see that black hose coming out of the firewall. And it simply just goes to my left, and then it ends. And if I come around and follow that black hose, it ends right up there. There's the end of the black hose. That is what is the drain for our evaporator. Because if you remember, our evaporator not only removes heat from the air that passes through it, it also removes water. It is cold, so it attracts humidity and condenses water in the air, and we get water. We get water dripping and running off of our evaporator. It has to go somewhere. It can't just sit there. It can't stay in the car. So evaporators always have some sort of drain to where this water can run out of the vehicle. So, couple things. If you are getting water in your vehicle when the AC is running, this drain hose is probably plugged up or it's disconnected. So you always want to check that. Also, if we think we have a leaky evaporator, well, our refrigerant is going to leak out this hose. We're going to get vapor coming out this hose. So you could take your sniffer and put the end on this evaporator drain hose and see if our sniffer shows us anything. Now we see it's kind of green up there on the end. That is because this Armada has a bad evaporator. So let's look at this under black light, because that green is actually our oil and our dye, our UV dye that we've put in this. Okay, so let me turn the black light on, and then bam, you see we get glowing green up there. That shows us that we do have a leaky evaporator. And then if I look right here on my frame, You see I've got a little bit of a glow right there where it's run down and leaked. It's not as green and glowy as right up there, but again, you see the glowing on the end of that evaporator drain hose. That's showing us that we've got oil and dye running out of there. That's showing us we've got a leak in that evaporator case. And in this case, it's the evaporator. It's not the O-rings for the expansion valve. But this is where our dye detection, our UV dye leak detection works. Is we couldn't find this leak. Well, we added some UV dye to the system, and lo and behold, worst case scenario, worst leak possible, an evaporator. To do an evaporator, you usually have to remove part of or all of the dash. This truck right here, I think it is a 9.5 hour job. Warranty time, which real world time, that's probably closer to 12 or 13 hours. So that's a serious repair. But again, we wouldn't have found that without our ultraviolet dye. So don't forget to check the evaporator drain if you're having issues or if you have a leak that you just simply can't find.